Hello. In this video, we are going to look at the first part of our character controller. So for the game that you'll be making, it is going to require a first-person controller. And first-person controller have a variety of components that are involved with them. The first main component with a first-person controller would be the camera movement. So you need some sort of movement script that either works with like the analog stick on a joystick or the movement of your mouse. So the type of control that we're going to create is going to be like a first-person controller, uses WASD to move around, and also uses the mouse to look around. Now, as you know already, there's two different types of character controllers that are, most often used in Unity. There is one that uses the character controller component, which is a component that is used for creating a character controller. And then the other style of character controller that's pretty common is a rigid body controller that uses the rigid body physics of the game engine to make the player move around. Now each one has their plus and minuses, but for this particular set of videos, we're going to be focusing on the character controller component. I will have some extra credit videos that cover the rigid body character controller, but it's not going to be required for what would be the final version of this game. But I will cover both types of character controllers. So in this video, we're going to be looking at creating the first-person controller using the character controller component. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new scene to start this off. I'm going to go to plus and add in a new scene, and I'm going to call this FP scene for first-person scene. And we'll open that up. Now, set up in the scene, we're going to need a couple of components. We're going to need something to run around on for now. So I'm going to go to 3D Object and create a plane in our scene, and then I'll double click on this plane and head into isometric view. Maybe double click on it again, and let's try to rotate around here to see our plane. So there's our plane inside of our scene, and I'm just going to use the scale tool to scale this up, but before I do that, I'm going to center that in the middle of our world space just by zeroing out the transform component, and I'm going to focus in on it again, and I'm going to make it larger, give us some space to run around on. And one last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a cube out there just to give us like a frame of reference as to where we are inside of the scene. Alright, cool. So that cube will be out there so that we know exactly where we're looking at. Alright, so when we create this particular character controller, we're going to need to start off with an empty game object. So I'm going to create a empty game object, and I'm going to call this player CC because it uses the character controller component, and I keep capitalizing those L's. And I'm going to add the character controller component to this. So you can do a quick search for that, and here it is. So the character controller component is great because it has a lot of built-in features for things like climbing up slopes, walking up steps, collision to a certain extent, its radius and height, that sort of thing. Now the one thing that it doesn't have is it doesn't have the ability to work with the physics engine inherently. If you wanted to be able to do things like interact with gravity, have pushback like when the player gets shot, you have to program those things in yourself using the character controller component because it does not interact with the physics engine. You can interact with physics objects. It will collide with colliders, but it won't do things like bounce. You won't be able to use the physics materials, anything like that. So if you think that you need those types of options, then the rigid body character controller would probably be a good place to start. But for this particular game that we're creating, I don't think it's 100% necessary. Plus, you should have some sort of frame of reference around the character controller because it's a good way to get up and running. And if you've been around game development for a while, you've probably been exposed to a lot of the formulas that we're going to be using on this thing. So it really isn't like that much extra work to kind of make this thing work the way you want it to. It's just you have to recognize that those are the differences between those two types of character controllers. So we'll get a little bit more into the character controller component in the next video. In this one, what we're going to do is just focus on creating the basis of it. And you can see I just moved it above the ground plane here, and I'm going to focus in on him so we can see him, just so that when the game starts, he doesn't fall through. Alright, so a couple of things that we're going to need for this. I'm going to create a 3D capsule, and this capsule should be roughly the same size as the character controller. This capsule, I'll just click and drag it into the player character controller that we've created, and you can see it's nested inside of it. And this is just here to be visible, so we're not going to need the capsule collider on this thing. I'm just going to remove it completely so that it's not on the game object because we don't want it interfering with our player controller at all. And I'm just going to increase the radius of the character controller to like 0.6, so it's a little bit bigger than that capsule. Okay. The next thing that we're going to need to attach to this guy is a camera. So we have a camera already created in our scene, so what we could do is just drag the main camera into the player character controller. And from here, what we're going to want to do is make sure it's zeroed out on the player. So I'm just going to zero it out on the z-axis. And as you can see, it's here. And I'm going to move it so that it's right at the top of the player controller, like this. So it should look something like this. You could even have it clipping, you want to have it inside of the character controller collider, because that way when you jump, the camera will be less likely to clip through ceilings and that sort of thing. But I can even show you some scripts to kind of fix that, mitigate that issue as well. Alright, so we have the camera up above, and the first thing we're going to do is program this camera, and we're going to program it to move with the mouse. So what we want to do is we want to take the vertical axes of the mouse movement, right? And we want to make it so that it rotates the camera up and down, right? Now that's the only thing that this mouse movement is going to control as far as the camera movement goes. The next thing we're going to do is we don't want to rotate the camera horizontally. We actually want to rotate the entire player controller horizontally. So the second component of this mouse look script that we're going to create is going to rotate the entire character controller. And what that'll do is it'll make it so that when we move using ASWD, our player will move in the direction that we're looking in, as opposed to looking in one direction and moving in another. It allows us to give us strafing and steering using the mouse. Alright, so what we need to do is create a look script. So I'm going to go to my scripts folder, and I'm going to create a new C# script, and this is going to be FP mouse look. I will open that up in Visual Studio. Alright, so we have our FP mouse look script created. Now we just need to start setting this thing up. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a couple of variables here. The first variable that we're going to need is a variable to manage like the sensitivity, and we can make this a public. So this is going to be a public float. Oh, I'm creating this in the wrong spot. I'm like, why isn't this registering? Because it needs to be down here. So public float. And we're going to call this M sensitivity. Sensitivity. So M sensitivity, and we'll give this a default value to start off with of 100.0 F. We're also going to need access to the transform of the parent object, which is that game object that we created for the player character controller. So this is also going to be a public variable, and it's going to be a transform. And we're going to call this player object. So I'll just call it player OBJ. And the last thing we're going to need is some sort of variable that stores the X rotation when we do the horizontal rotation. So I'm going to create a float value here, and we'll call this XRot. And XRot will be equal to 0F. And no need to make that public. Alright, so in the start function, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to lock the cursor. Locking the cursor, what they'll do is make it so that the cursor is not visible in the game. So we're going to set the cursor dot lock state equal to cursor lock mode dot locked. So cursor lock mode dot locked. Alright, so that'll lock our cursor in the scene. Alright, so inside of our update function, that's where we're going to start grabbing the values to move our camera. So I'll just throw in a quick comment here. Gets inputs from mouse. This is going to get the input values, by the way. And you can also get from joystick too, because we're going to be using the axes inside of Unity. Alright, so it gets input from mouse or joystick, not form, from. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a float for the mouse X. So float mouse X. And we're going to set this equal to input.getAxis. And the axis that we're going to grab is horizontal. And this needs to be in quotes. Now the reason why this needs to be in quotes is because this is a default axis that's set up in the Unity axis system. Now Unity is rolling out the release of a new input system that I'm going to cover in an extra credits video to go along with this. But I don't believe this input system is going to be replaced for quite some time. So to get to this input system, it automatically loads in when you create your project. So if you go to Edit and then Project Settings and then Input Manager and then Axes right here. So it creates this first one and it's got all of these defaults. This is that horizontal we just accessed here. It's got left and right. This is negative, positive, A and D, and it can use key, mouse, or joystick. Right. So all of these are set up by default, and the great thing about these is that they're set up so that when you call them, most of these inputs will work by default with a gamepad, with like a controller, or mouse and keyboard. So they kind of have dual interoperability. I guess this axis system has kind of frustrated people in the past. So Unity's tried to kind of simplify it by creating this new input manager system. This particular system allows you to duplicate control schemes quickly. So you could very easily create like multiplayer support. Like if I wanted to create a player 2 axes, I'd have to create a whole new set of axes for player 2 because you don't want these axes interrupting with the other player and vice versa. And this system does do a better job of mitigating those issues. But it says here, consider using the new input system package instead. And it's just a consideration. Like I said, I'm covering this here because I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. And there are going to be some systems that you might have to revert back to this to work with. But in the future, and like I said, check out the extra credits video where I'll be covering the systems input system package. We'll try and relate it to what we're doing here. But anyway, like I said, anything that's like a separate preview package that you have to install, I try not to include it too early because it's probably going to change quite a bit once it rolls out as the official release. Okay, so your inputs are in here. Long story short. I grabbed horizontal, but I think I grabbed the wrong input here. I actually wanted mouse X. So mouse. And the reason what kind of triggered that in my mind just now is that the spelling and capitalization absolutely matters with this. So if I go back to the editor real quick and open that back up. See how mouse X has a space and it's capitalized? This is what we're actually calling here is that name in that string. So the capitalization, the space is all that matters there. Alright, so we've got mouse X set up, and what we're going to do is we're going to multiply this by M sensitivity, and we're going to multiply that by time.delta time. And what that's going to do is ensure that we've got smooth movement from the last time that the frame was rendered inside of the scene. So you're actually doubling your multiplication there to set up the sensitivity and also the smoothness of it using time.delta time to advance the movement. You can actually copy this entire line because it's the same exact same exact thing we're going to need for the y-axis. So I'm going to duplicate this line here, and this is going to be mouse Y. Change this to mouse Y, and mouse sensitivity times time.delta time. Alright, so the first thing we're going to handle is rotating the camera up and down using mouse Y. So rotate, put a comment in here. Alright, and what we're going to do is we're going to grab our xrot variable that we created, and we're going to set this to minus equals mouse Y. And then the next thing we're going to do is clamp that rotation so that right now if we were to save this and apply this to our camera, we'd be able to flip the camera right around. So we're going to add some clamping in to make sure that it doesn't rotate all the way around and flip the camera upside down. So we're going to say xrot is equal to mathf. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger here. mathf.clamp, and mathf.clamp is going to get two values. One's going to be actually three values. One's going to be the value that we're going to clamp, so that's going to be xrot. And then the first is going to be its limit at the top for the minimum and the limit above. So we're going to do -90 for the minimum and 90 for the maximum. So that's going to clamp its rotation vertically. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the Y rotation of the camera. So to do that, we're going to grab the local rotation, so transform dot local rotation, actually I'm sorry, local rotation is equal to quaternion, and the quaternion is going to be quaternion dot Euler, and we're going to give it its values that it needs to rotate. So we're only going to be rotating on the x-axis. So we're going to pass to an x rot, comma 0, comma 0. And just going to put a float value here. Alright, so now that we have that, what we'll then do is take the player object and rotate that by whatever the mouse x is. So our player object we're holding in a variable, and we'll use the dot rotate function. That's not dot. Dot rotate. And we're going to pass this the rotation values that it needs. So the first is going to be the direction. So vector3 dot up, because we want to rotate this around the y-axis. And then we're going to multiply that by mouse x. That's mouse y. Mouse x. Alright, so we should be able to save this and apply this to our main camera. So I'm going to head back out, select the main camera, and drag the FP mouse look script here. And you can see the only thing we need is the player object. So the player object is this player CC, it's the parent. Drag this in here. And I'm just going to turn on maximize on play. And if we hit the play button, should be no mouse cursor. And if I look up, I can only look up so far. And if I look down, I can only look down so far. And I can rotate left and right. Now the last thing you're going to probably want to test is the rotation of the player object. So I'm going to shut off maximize on play for this test. Hit play, and I'm just going to watch this in the scene view. And let's see here. Turn on my move tool. And oh, I still have the camera selected. I need to select the player character controller here. And it does not seem to be rotating the player controller. Let's see, let's go to pivot is on global, local. Yeah, there it is. So under local rotation, we can see that the pivot, I had to change this value up here for local. So it's originally set to global. If I set it to local, we'll see the local rotation of the object here. Alright, so now in the next video, part 2, when we program the movement, it will move in the direction that we're looking in. Okay, so we'll see you in the next one.